colleagues who planned this event tonight, Leonard Enns, Hildy Fraze-Thiessen, and David Y. Neufeld. And thank you to Knox Presbyterian Church for hosting us. The program will proceed without intermission, and you are invited to a reception across the hall with plots and butter tarts prepared at Conrad Grebel University College. The plots and the butter tarts representing the encounter between Russian Mennonites and Swiss Mennonites that occurred here in this place. We invite modest and also large cash donations to support the expenses of this event, and there's boxes just outside the doorway for that. Any surplus from those boxes will be forwarded to Mennonite Central Committee for the Russlaender Centenary Remembrance Fund, which is described in your program. And Stephen Roy from MCC Ontario is here, will be at a table in the foyer to receive donations directly to the Remembrance Fund. As settlers on this land who are commemorating and celebrating that settlement, it is imperative that we acknowledge the first peoples of this land. Today, we acknowledge that the land to which the Ontario Russlaender came resides within the ancestral and treaty territory of the original peoples of the Neutral Nation, the Haudenosaunee of the Grand River, and the Anishinaabe people of the Mississaugas of the Credit. The land where we are today is within the Haldimand Tract, 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River, from the mouth to the source, which was granted to the Haudenosaunee, known as Six Nations, in 1784, 2 years before Mennonites arrived from Pennsylvania. As we learn the history of these lands, we are committed to being part of a future where Indigenous sovereignty and treaties are honored, and we seek to be good neighbors with all those who love this land. We will begin our program with a hymn, and I invite Len to lead us in that.
Acknowledging the fact that German lasted longer for some people than for others, the hymns are all, I believe the word is macaronic. That doesn't mean macaroni. They're all in both languages, in 2 languages, not both languages. So sing the language of your choice, please. And also we will sing only 2 verses of each hymn. You'll see some hymns have more verses. We will actually only sing 2 verses, just in the interest of time and getting to the, what do we have back there? Schnitt. Yeah, getting to the schnitz. Okay. So I'll ask, during the composition itself, there are 2 movements, the very first one and the very last one, in which you will be invited to join. If you read ahead just a little bit, you'll see which page that music is on for you when we get there, but I will also mention it before each movement. So I'll ask you to stand for the hymns, but not for the pieces that are within my composition. So please stand for Großer Gott, wir loben dich, page 12.
On July 21st, 1923, the first group of Russlaender immigrants stepped off the train in Rostern, Saskatchewan. They came to be called Russlaender, the Russians, to differentiate them from a previous migration of Mennonites to Canada in the 19th century called Canadier, the Canadians. It wasn't until a year later that the first group of Russlaender to remain in Ontario stepped off the train in Waterloo. It was July 19, 1924, when close to 900 of these newcomers walked up Herb Street here to meet their Swiss Mennonite and Amish hosts at Herb Street Mennonite Church. We are in a place of memory. The Russlaender arrived in Canada from a place of memory. They had come to that place from Prussia at the end of the 18th century. What was this place? The Russian Empire, South Russia, Soviet Union, Siberia? What is this place? Russia, Siberia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine. We struggle to name these places of memory. When Mennonite families arrived on the steppes of southwestern Ukraine, they created settlements near the Dnipro River, calling them Kortitsa and Molochna. They gathered around trees, in meadows, and by rivers. They grew grain, milled flour, manufactured farm equipment. They built churches, schools, hospitals. They made music, painted, embroidered, and sewed, wrote poetry, and took photographs. Some were wealthy, some were poor. They enjoyed a life some of them referred to as immer Sommer, immer Sonntag, forever summer, forever Sunday. It seemed to be the promised land, a golden age, a time of industry and prosperity and culture. The memory of place does not always include the rifts, the conflicts, the judgments, the inequalities, the departures. By the 1920s, the Mennonite population was over 100,000 in 50 settlements, from Zagradovka colony near Odessa, Ukraine, in the west, to settlements near Omsk, Siberia, in the east. Yet, the years of trauma and loss had already begun. The tides had begun to turn for Mennonites in 1917, following the Bolshevik Revolution and a new political and economic order. In the several years that followed, Mennonites became targets of hostility and violence from those who resented, indeed despised, their Germanness, their political allegiances, their social and economic advantage, and their religious identity. In some villages, Eichenfeld, Blumenort, horrific massacres took place. Some fought back. Mennonite settlements in Ukraine were in the midst of civil war from 1918 to 1921 as various militaries, German, Bolshevik, and pro-Tsarist, fought for control of the region. An epidemic of typhus and starvation caused more death in Mennonite settlements. Places of memory became places of tragedy and loss. Mennonites in the Soviet Union began to look for a new place, a new home. While the United States was viewed as the most desirable destination by some, restrictive immigration quotas closed the door on that option. Paraguay and Mexico were also explored as possibilities. The Canadian Mennonite Board of Colonization was created in 1922 to negotiate what would become a mass migration of 21,000 over the decade of the 1920s. Canada was not initially keen about admitting a religious minority, a group that had been banned from Canada from 1919 to 1922. The Canadian government was in such a mood that many ethnic groups were discouraged from immigration or banned outright. It is a tragic irony that we celebrate the arrival of Mennonites in Canada in 1923, the same year as the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, banning all Chinese immigration to Canada. The intervention of Canada's two national railways, who needed farmers for their land, changed the government's mood. And so the CPR agreed to transport desperate Mennonite refugees from the Soviet Union to Canada. Those refugees then owned a travel debt, the Reiseschuld, to the railway, a debt that took years to repay. Most of the Russlaender arrived between 1924 and 1926, about 15,000. Stalin's 5-year plan, which limited freedoms and introduced repression, saw more Mennonites desire to leave the Soviet Union, but fewer were allowed to do so. By 1929, Canada too was beginning to close its door. Desperation set in. In 1930, only 300 Russlaender made it to Canada. The Promised Land had become a lost paradise.
The first piece in this suite reflects the sort of nostalgic, speaks of the nostalgic view of the old country, the country that was left. I've embedded a little folk song that came with some of the people, and I don't know how many people, Wer pflanzte die Blumen ins grüne Feld. If you know that, I will invite you to sing along. So if you turn to page 5 in your program, you have the texts for these pieces. And in this case, if you also keep your thumb on page 13, you'll be ready to join us when the time comes. So you're part of the choir.
There are many narratives about those journeys the Mennonites took out of the former Soviet Union. My own parents left in haste in 1929, teenagers with their families in flight from different parts of the country. Others left earlier that decade, of course, under somewhat less chaotic and nevertheless thoroughly challenging circumstances. Each story is a little different. Among the refugees fleeing the Russian Mennonite colonies in 1923, 100 years ago this week, was Peter Gerard Rempel, familiar to many of us as the photographer whose studio photographs of the Mennonites in Russia were published in 1981 in a book entitled Forever Summer, Forever Sunday. Rempel, a widower, kept a diary describing his immigration during the latter half of 1923. He began his trip along with 751 other Mennonites, including his sons, Otto and Henry. In particular, he mentions them, and in one of over 20 cattle cars on Friday, the 13th of July, 1923. He was 50 years old. He would arrive in Canada 4 months later and settle, eventually, right here in Kitchener-Waterloo. Today, Rempel wrote in his first diary entry, at 5:18 p.m., the third group of our people left from the Kortitsa railway station. Before long, we proceeded across the Dnieper. Yes, that very river that's in the news these days. The trip, he remarked after 2 days, was proceeding well, and the émigrés were enjoying each other's company. We all knew why we were leaving our homeland, he wrote, and this kept us going. This morning, the bathhouse was heated, he wrote a few days later, and each of us had a bath, and the clothes we had been wearing were disinfected. After several more days, when the train came to a standstill in a huge forest, he reported that everything, large and small, was dragged out of the boxcar for the brewing of prips and tea. Several people had even finer fare. They fried ham, sausage, and like. My boys made fried potatoes. When they realized that they'd be there all day, some of them took naps, others read, some played chess, a few went in search of strawberries in the woods. Some sat and talked. You can imagine about what, he wrote. When 5 days later they arrived at the Russian border, they were held up for a whole day and night. Very close to the station was a pretty lake which was discovered soon enough by the little boys, and while they played in the water, the women and girls took the opportunity to do their wash. Meanwhile, they were compelled to take everything out of the boxcars and to unlock their trunks so that the custom officials could examine their belongings. Among my things, he wrote, they opened only the large trunk that held my books. They didn't even see the big basket that contained my wall clock and my alarm, and I was so pleased that I could take these with me. In the evening, he continued, when it was time to go to sleep, all of us were in no doubt thinking the same thing. Only one more night in Russia. It wasn't long after they had finished their breakfast the next day that the train began to move, slowly at first. At 10 minutes past 8, it proceeded through the large gate that marked the boundary between Russia and Latvia. Exactly at the point where our boxcar crossed the border, Rempel wrote, all of us cried out loudly as with one voice, hurrah, hurrah, hurrah. I believe each one of us must have sensed what the Israelites felt after they had passed on dry land through the sea and the waves returned to prevent the Egyptians from ever harming them again. We were in a foreign country now. It was immediately apparent that it was no longer Russia. In the morning, they transferred to Latvian freight cars. Of the following week, Rempel wrote, as soon as we had moved into the barracks, we were examined by Canadian doctors. Of the 752 people on our train, 204 were found to have trachoma, a bacterial eye infection that spreads through personal contact. We were shattered. Families were torn apart. Those who were healthy were permitted to leave, and those who were declared unhealthy had to proceed to Lechfeld, Germany, a refugee transit camp established in Bavaria for Russian Mennonites who, for health reasons, were temporarily held back from emigration. Rempel and his son Otto had to go to Germany. The other son, Henry, was found to have healthy eyes and was allowed to leave. And so it was another time for farewells. It was early August when they crossed the border from Lithuania into Germany, where they were eventually placed in passenger cars, 4th class. It certainly is a complete change from traveling in those cattle cars, Rempel wrote. One simply feels more human. They were greeted warmly when they arrived in Berlin, where welcome banners were hung in the station, and where, after listening to a few speeches, they sang and then posed for a group photograph. When they arrived in Lechfeld, they were given lunch and directed to bathe, and again, their clothes were disinfected. Finally, they were taken to barracks, where everyone was given a straw mattress, a straw pillow, a blanket, a wash basin, and a towel. Rempel remained in Lechfeld for eye exams and treatments for almost 3 months. After about 2.5 weeks there, in August, he wrote, "Today we were finally allowed to outside the barbed wire of the barracks. Oh, we were happy to have some freedom again. We sprang around like spring calves." 4 days later, he wrote, "We were warned several days in advance that an English doctor was to come from Hamburg to examine our eyes, and this morning he arrived. Most thought that they would now be allowed to go to America, but they had deceived themselves, and I had too. I was absolutely determined to go, but was held back. But Otto was lucky. He'll be able to leave in a few days, and so I'll have to stay all alone." 2 more weeks passed before another medical exam. "I was eager to be able to go at last," Rempel wrote, "but my excitement was again unfounded. I have to stay a while longer." He added, "In my opinion, my eyes are perfectly healthy." By mid-September, Rempel, bored with the tedium of barracks life, took a 4-day trip. I thought of it like this," he wrote, "if you're going to travel, then travel." This pleasant indulgence, he reported later, cost the equivalent of a pound of sausage. A week later, they were to be examined by another physician from Hamburg. "We all wanted desperately to be able to leave," he wrote, "and when the hour of decision was near, everyone prepared for it. Several put on their best clothes, tie and collar, freshly polished shoes, etc. Anything to impress the doctor and convince him to grant permission to move on. I can't believe that their efforts did any good, and yet 270 were allowed to go, far more than we had anticipated. Those of us who had to remain accompanied those who left the railway station. It was again time to say goodbye. Naturally, many of us cried. Yes, many a hot tear rolled down our cheeks. When the train began to move, we sang, "God be with us till we meet again." A month later, he was among the fortunate ones and allowed to go, along with 312 others. It was hardly believable that the moment had actually come when we could take up our journey. He had yearned for it for so long. When it was time to leave for the station, he wrote, "We all had to gather in one place, and each person was then called up by name, and then we were suddenly told to march ahead, and this huge mass of people set itself slowly in motion. There were 313 of us, and almost 200 more, I think, accompanied us to the station. At the last, one more warm handshake, and away we went into the big, wide world." The thoughts that had come to me 3 months earlier when I left Kortitsa, he said, now swarmed back. The train rushed forward like a storm, and in just a few minutes, Lechfeld had disappeared. After 2 days, he wrote, "As we crossed Rotterdam, I was in an exceptionally good mood. I actually felt as young children do on Christmas Eve. They lie in their beds and out of sheer excitement can hardly fall asleep because the thought is always there, what will Father Christmas bring me tonight? I had the same thoughts about my sea voyage." 2 days later, they arrived in London at 5:50 in the morning. The Londoners looked at us as if our car was packed full of antediluvian animals, giraffes and the like. Presumably, had they had their way, they would not have sent us on to the railway station, but to the zoo, where they would have put us behind bars and examined us at their leisure. The next day, on the 31st of October, 1923, in a shed in a harbor in Southampton, it was his turn to stand one more time before the eye doctor. As I stood I was about to say so helplessly before this doctor, I felt as though I was standing before a very great and severe judge who had complete control over my life, who would now set me free or condemn me to death. Thank God I was allowed to proceed. It wasn't long before I took my first trip on the bottom stair leading up into the great ship, the Empress of France. It was a most important step, because with it I abandoned the continent of Europe. Shortly after the ship left the harbor in Southampton, he wrote, we went onto the deck, and I stood there until dark and watched the coast of Europe gradually disappear. As I stood there, I couldn't help but recall the story of the prodigal son, who had enjoyed so much that was good in his father's house, and yet had thanklessly turned his back on it one day. Yet after a time, he returned. And I asked myself, are you not doing the same thing? How many good things have you received in your 50 years in your fatherland, and now you too are turning your back on it? The prodigal son finally returned, but you don't want ever to go back. You just want to get away from here. I asked myself again whether I had really behaved unjustly in leaving my fatherland, but soon came to the conclusion that it was not wrong to escape all these things that were happening. I was so perplexed as I stood there then, alone on the deck of the ship, pondering my past and my future. Europe was my past, America my future, and right now I was on a ship between them. And as I stood alone leaning against the mast, I didn't notice how dark it had become. When my thoughts finally stopped swarming in my head, I looked around me and saw above the raven black night, and below the deep and horrifying ocean, and all around the raging billows of the sea. And I couldn't stand being alone up there any longer. I went below to find some company. The next morning, November 1st, he wrote, before I went to breakfast, I rushed up to the deck to catch one last glimpse of Europe, but there was nothing to be seen, only sky and water. Europe had disappeared. On the ship after supper the following day, we sat around and told each other cock and bull stories about what we would do when we got to America, how we would farm, etc., so that farming began to intrigue even me. On the 5th day of Rempo's sea voyage to Canada, he wrote, today we are at the midpoint of our voyage. I had to think how far we were from both shores. Yes, and how far have I escaped from home? The next day, this evening, we were all so happy because at 8 p.m. we were able to see several lighthouses off Newfoundland. Everyone hurled out to the deck. By late afternoon the following day, they could see the coast of America. 2 days later, on November 8th, their possessions were, according to custom, disinfected again. And while they were bathing, their clothes too. By now, Rempel wrote, all our goods had been disinfected so often that I thought that those tiniest of bacilli that had so far managed to stay alive deserved to be left alone. And indeed, those bacilli would be left alone, for he had finally arrived at his destination, Canada. On the 9th of November, 1923, 17 weeks after he left his home in Kortitsa, Peter Gerard Rempel exclaimed, we are again on dry land, yes, in the land of freedom.
If you're able to stand, please do. The hymn is on page 14. O have you not heard, or Ich weiß einen Strom.
The Mennonites walking up Herb Street in the summer of 1924 were undoubtedly full of fear and uncertainty. They were afraid for those left behind who couldn't or wouldn't join them in North America. They were afraid for what lay ahead. How would they pay back their travel loans? Would they find a job or a farm? Could they buy a house? Could they revive their collective church life or their personal faith? Would they sing new songs? At Herb Street Mennonite Church, they met people who were familiar, yet very different. The Swiss Mennonites and Amish were already 100 years in Canada, after their ancestors settled here from Pennsylvania and Europe. As the Russlaender waited at the church to meet their hosts, everyone later recalled, "We were the last ones to be chosen." Many stayed in the homes of their Ontario hosts for a year or even more. It was an early form of refugee sponsorship, one might say. They went to Ayr, to Breslau, to Milverton, to Vineland, to Zurich, and more. Jobs were found working on farms or in the factories of Kitchener-Waterloo. Forsyth and Arrow shirts, Kaufman rubber. In time, some would travel west to the prairies or further. Some went to Pelee Island and Leamington. During the harsh years of the Depression on the prairies, some Russlaender moved to the Niagara Peninsula, where they grew and processed fruit and vegetables. Only a few years after arriving in Canada, some Russlaender established a new settlement called Reeser in the far northeast corner of Ontario. Now called a ghost town, Reeser had 226 people living on 55 homesteads in 1928. 20 years later, the Mennonite church closed, and now Reeser is a place only of memory. Here are some of these memories of expectation, those fulfilled and those dashed. First, from Maria Brown's account. Saturday, the 19th of July, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we arrived in Waterloo. The train stopped and we were all to disembark. We were to be greeted in a church, but because the road had been freshly paved, we couldn't be taken there by automobiles. We had to walk. The church was too small to accommodate all of us, so they welcomed us in the churchyard. There were shelters where the buggies stood on Sundays. They had prepared board benches in these shelters so we could all sit and be in the shade. The people were very friendly and good to us. We were given our supper there. Each of us got a bag filled with some food. Cups were brought in big baskets, and coffee was served from huge milk cans. There was such a crowd of people that they had to put up a thick rope to separate us. The Canadians had to stay on the other side of the rope. It was very warm and dusty. In the middle of the yard, they had raised a platform from which we were welcomed and greeted by a number of preachers and by the committee. They came with little papers and asked for our names. All 900 of us were to be billeted for the night. The farmers had divided us amongst themselves. Jacob H. and Eliza Jansen and their blended family of 10 children arrived in Kitchener December 27th, 1924. Writing back to one son left behind in Russia, they said, "The train stopped in Galt and we got off. We looked in vain for the members of the committee. No one had come to meet us. But our large family had again attracted the kindness of our fellow passengers and the railway personnel, and they gave us directions so that even without Mennonite guidance, we got onto the electric trolley car, which was supposed to take us to Waterloo, but actually only brought us as far as Kitchener. Here, someone from the Mennonites would have to receive us, or we really wouldn't know how to go on, even though we were well-traveled people. We were somewhat frightened by the terrible cold here, and the future was a worry because we had nothing, neither fuel nor food nor clothing." About their old order Mennonite hosts, the Enos Bauman family, Jansen wrote further, "Enos Bauman is one of those people who thinks that electricity is evil. He doesn't have a car either, but he has a motor to drive his machinery. It seems that if a motor stays in one place and does work, it's not as sinful as when it zooms along the road. They are all biblical, it seems to me, and have biblical names like Moses, Jeremiah, Jonathan, Noah, and so on. Gerhard Wientz arrived in Canada on July 19th, 1924, as a 19-year-old. I arrived in Waterloo and went to work for a Pennsylvania Dutch Mennonite farmer. My boss and his wife, a handsome, well-dressed young couple, brought me home in their shining black Model T coupe. I could hardly believe it. How could a farmer afford a distinguished vehicle like that? My boss must be richer than the average farmer. At 25 miles per hour, we flew through the beautiful countryside on magnificent gravel roads. I'd ridden in a car only once before in Russia on a dirt road. It seemed mighty decent of my boss to let me, his laborer, ride in his car beside him and his wife. In Russia, he might have arranged to have had another laborer fetch me in the farm wagon. This was but the first of countless situations in which I have seen American democracy in all its decency and vitality. After we arrived at the farm and I'd unpacked my few belongings, I went outside to explore the yard. I saw no laborers, no maids, and wondered where they might be this evening. I strolled into the barn, and there beside a long row of Holsteins, I saw a man milking. I was startled. I had never seen a man milk. At home, milking was a woman's job and a disgrace to a man. Perhaps there was a shortage of maids here this evening, and this kind-hearted laborer had swallowed his pride and jumped in to help. I was about to ask him where the boss might be when this man addressed me by my name, and I recognized my boss. That smartly dressed gentleman of the Model T sat there on a dirty stool in soiled overalls and a battered straw hat, milking. He asked me if I knew how to milk, and I laughed. The next evening, he was laughing at this desperate greenhorn. Anna Baird kept a diary that spoke of her family's arrival in Waterloo in the summer of 1924. She and her family were hosted by the Oliver Schneider family. Waterloo, the conductor's announcement passed through me like a shudder. I would just as soon have kept right on going. But then we had to stop somewhere. We were greeted by a huge crowd of people. They all peered in at us with friendly faces, but one had the feeling that we were being appraised. A few instructions were read to us in English and German. Something about if a worker and his employer have problems with one another, they should appeal to some sort of Mennonite social committee. Moreover, no immigrant is allowed to look for work in the city. Everyone is to work on farms. The farmers came forward. You could recognize them by their big black hats. The women in black with bonnets decorated with little pearls, like I imagine them to have been worn in the Middle Ages, all of them looking for the people whose names they read from pieces of paper. One family after another was driven away by automobile in this fashion. Only our family did not seem to have a place with anybody. Her last diary entry, a month after arrival. I've been staring at the moon's face for a while, how calmly and silently he follows his dreamy path, as if he were steeped in thoughts about all nature beneath him. Yes, it's the very same moon that dreams over the sky at home. If only I could travel with him and see what our friends were doing now. Oh, the earth is just as black here as there, the sky just as blue, and people all have noses in the middle of their faces wherever you go. In other words, one can live here, even live well, but it's not home. The English language sounds so harsh and foreign. I don't think I'll ever learn to like it. Still, it's time for bed. I'm tired, and who knows what tomorrow will bring. Maria Enns wrote the following about her arrival in Ontario to her sister still in Ukraine. They were hosted on the farm of Bishop Jonas Snyder. We like it where we live. Our family of 5 and a family of 4 share the kitchen facilities. Our hosts are very friendly and helpful. They'll ask, "Are you in need of potatoes, lard, eggs?" And if we say we need these, they bring them to us immediately. When we arrived here, the beds were ready for us, with blankets, pillows, and sheets. There was a nice metal stove for cooking, a frying pan, 6 cups, 6 plates, knives and forks and spoons. We even have a sofa and a rocking chair. We were speechless, unable to express our feelings. It raised our emotions to the point of breaking as we realized how concerned our hosts were in supplying everything in such detail. Finally, an entry from the journal of Abram Harder, who arrived in August 1924. At long last, my years of hoping and dreaming are about to be fulfilled. A few more hours of sailing and we'll touch Canadian soil in Quebec. Today is my birthday. I'm 45 years of age, and I call out with the words of the psalmist, "And I will walk in liberty, for I seek thy precepts." On the day of my birth, my mother placed me into a cradle in Clayfeld. Today, the waves of fate gently rock me onto the shores of America. Where will I find a home for myself and my large family? Where shall we find a home for our daily pursuits? How many days will there be for me in this strange land? With mixed feelings and emotions, and yet with a deep conviction that I've done the right thing, I cry out with the words, "My God, my hope is in thee."
You'll find the next hymn on page 16. Befiehl dir deine Wege. So nimm denn meine Hände, take thou my hand, O Father. Please stand.
In time, the Russlaender understood they had found a new promised land in Canada. Once again, they sang, they painted, they wrote poetry, embroidered, and took photographs. Once again, they prospered, yet they always went back in their minds and hearts to that place of memory, to the ones left behind. Sometimes their memories were held in places of silence, sometimes in places of tears. By 1930, it was no longer possible to emigrate as the Soviet state tightened its grip of repression on its citizens, and as Canada closed its door to immigration. The Stalin era was filled with terror, famine, arrests, and loss. Mennonite families in that place experienced separation, violence, hunger, and death. At the end of the Second World War, more family separations occurred as thousands fled to the West, while thousands more were sent to the Gulag. Russlaender in Canada prayed and hoped that family members left behind would live and join them in the West. They felt the guilt of survival. Letters of desperation crossed the ocean. Maria Wishart-Franzen, a widow whose husband died of typhus in 1922, immigrated to Canada in 1926 with her 8 children, finding work and a home in Vineland, Ontario. Maria had ongoing correspondence with her cousins left behind in the Soviet Union, and they wrote these fragments in 1932 and 1933. We are not busy preparing meals because we have no ingredients, and we do not need to bake bread as we have no flour. We have no horses, no cows, no sheep or pigs, just a few chickens, no flour. We have never experienced this before. I have lost a lot of weight because I have worked so hard. We wonder what the future will bring. Lisa Regier, a young woman of 21 in exile in the Ural Mountains region, wrote to her relatives on the Canadian prairies in 1933. Dear Geschwister, actually I have no joy in writing, for what should I write to you? Here there is no good news, only hunger, distress, affliction, and grief. Dear loved ones, I wish you could be in our midst for a second. I know you would have imagined our situation only half as bad as it really is. Papa is sick, he cannot walk anymore. His feet are extremely swollen. Mama coughs a great deal and is terribly skinny. We children are reasonably well, but have also suffered very much. We have frozen and starved. I wish you all the very best of health. May God protect you from the misery which has overtaken us. Yash and Maria Regier wrote to relatives in Canada from Siberia in 1932. At times, we just cannot understand the leading of God, and still we believe that his ways are right and we do not become discouraged. Please continue to pray for us. Our situation is desperate. We are without bread, without money, in exile, considered sheep for the slaughter, required to work hard. And our children, Lisa in prison, Peter suffering from typhus, the little ones crying and begging for bread. Today is the 6th day without bread. Then our efforts to stay quiet before God and to trust in God are put to the acid test. Often there are hours when we are submerged in despair, but we believe that the prayers of God's children protect us and support us so that the burden does not become too great to carry. There are many here who have despaired of God's help. Write to us often and write much, dear Geschwister. We get fresh courage when we read and hear of the things you write. Tears were shed and continue to be shed as letters crossed oceans and continents, as they were read and reread. The memories and tears made places holy.
Page 18, Wehrlos und Verlassen in the Rifted Rock. Please stand. Contrary to tradition, we'll sit for the blessing. I'll ask you to join on the final Amen. Many of you will know it from the Peter Lutkin hymn in the hymn book. The page is given to you. And then we'll stand at the end for the last hymn. Please stand for Ich bete an.
Thank you for coming this evening. Please join us for plots and tarts, and join me in thanking Len and the choir and Miriam.